The decline of the Indus Valley civilization did not come with fire or conquest. There are no signs of mass destruction, no evidence of foreign invasion. Instead, beginning around 1900 BCE, the cities began to change subtly at first, then more visibly. Populations in major centers like Mohenjodaro and Harappa started to shrink. Homes were abandoned. Streets grew quiet. Archaeological layers from this period show clear signs of urban decay. Carefully planned layouts gave way to disorder. New buildings were constructed hastily, often on top of older structures misaligned, cramped, and poorly made. Even the famous Indus bricks, once uniform and standardized across hundreds of kilometers, began to lose consistency. Craftsmanship declined. Workshops that once produced fine pottery, beads, and seals fell silent. The distinctive Indus script, once seen on seals and tablets, gradually disappeared from use. What we see is not a sudden collapse, but a long, uneven process of disintegration. Some neighborhoods were reused, others were left to crumble. Public infrastructure fell into disrepair, drainage systems clogged. When cold. It appears that people began moving away from the cities, perhaps returning to rural life, or forming smaller settlements beyond the urban centers. This gradual breakdown marked the beginning of the end for one of the world's most remarkable early civilizations. A civilization that had lasted for over 700 years, quietly entering its twilight. One of the key drivers of the Indus Valley's decline may have come from the skies. Climate records suggest that, around 1900 BCE, the region began to experience a major shift in monsoon patterns. For centuries, the Indus cities had relied on seasonal rains to flood their rivers and nourish the soil. But as the monsoons weakened and became less predictable, that system began to fail. The once dependable rivers started to dry. Wells, once central to urban life, dropped lower each year. Canals and reservoirs could no longer keep pace with the needs of growing populations. Archaeological and geological evidence points to a long-term drought, possibly lasting several centuries. As rainfall declined, agriculture became harder to sustain. Fields that once supported surplus farming yielded less and less. Without water, urban life grew more difficult. Food shortages may have increased. Trade dependent on agricultural surplus likely declined as well. This environmental pressure didn't just affect one city. It impacted the entire region from Harappa in the north to Dholavira in the south. Many settlements were built along rivers like the Harappa, which may have once flowed year-round. By this period, it had started to dry up, leaving towns without the lifeline they depended on. The changing climate didn't destroy the Indus civilization overnight, but it may have made its great cities increasingly unsustainable, pushing people to adapt, relocate, or abandon urban life altogether. As rainfall declined, another force quietly reshaped the Indus landscape: the rivers themselves. The Indus civilization had grown alongside powerful water systems. But over time, some of those rivers began to shift or disappear. One of the most important was the Harappa River, a river many scholars believe may be the long-lost Sarasvati. Mentioned in ancient texts, archaeological surveys show that dozens of Indus settlements were built along its banks. These communities depended entirely on its waters for drinking, farming, and trade. But as the climate changed, the Harappa gradually dried up. Its once strong flow weakened into seasonal trickles. Eventually, it vanished in some stretches, leaving behind only dry beds of silt and sand. This was not just a change in geography, it was a disruption to daily life. Irrigation systems failed, crops withered, trade routes were cut off. Entire towns, once thriving, were suddenly stranded, with no water and no way to adapt. As the rivers changed their course or disappeared entirely, settlements were abandoned. Satellite imagery and geological studies confirm this pattern, a clear alignment between river shifts and the locations of deserted Indus towns. Some people likely tried to relocate. Others may have moved eastward, toward more stable water sources like the Ganges. The shifting rivers, once the lifeblood of the Indus world, had become unpredictable, even dangerous. And with their disappearance, so too, faded many of the cities built along their banks. As water sources failed and cities emptied, the economic system that had once sustained the Indus civilization also began to break down. For centuries, the Indus Valley had maintained long-distance trade routes reaching Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and the Persian Gulf. Goods like cotton textiles, beads, carnelian, and metalwork moved across deserts and seas. But now, those networks began to fray. With rivers drying up and ports becoming less active, trade slowed and in some areas may have collapsed entirely. Imports and exports diminished, foreign goods became scarce, and merchants lost their links to distant markets. At the same time, signs of internal instability began to appear. The uniform system of standardized weights, once used for fair trade, declined. Later weights are irregular, scattered, and often locally made. Craftsmanship also suffered. Workshops that had once produced intricate beads, painted pottery, and expertly carved seals grew inconsistent. Some shut down altogether. This wasn't just about trade, it was about identity. The economic order of the Indus Valley had depended on shared standards and specialization. When those broke down, so did the cohesion of urban life. Without reliable trade, cities could no longer support large populations or highly specialized labor. Potters, metal workers, traders all struggled as demand dropped and surplus disappeared. The cities didn't just lose people, they lost purpose. And with that, a major pillar of the civilization's success began to crumble from within. As the Indus civilization entered its final centuries, the cities themselves began to change, and not for the better. The carefully planned layouts that had once defined Harappa, Mohenjodaro, and Dholavira started to break down. Straight streets became irregular. New homes were built directly on top of older ones, without alignment or coordination. In many areas, once orderly neighborhoods turned into crowded clusters of makeshift structures. The change wasn't just in design, it was in function. Public infrastructure, one of the civilization's great achievements, began to deteriorate. Drainage systems, which had once carried wastewater beneath every street, were left clogged and unrepaired. Wells ran dry, and some public bathing areas were abandoned altogether. Even the symbols of shared culture began to vanish. The iconic steatite seals, once used in trade and administration, became fewer and less detailed. Inscriptions in the Indus script nearly disappeared. It's clear that something deeper was unraveling. The systems that held the cities together, planning, sanitation, governance, and communication, were breaking down piece by piece. This was not a simple matter of buildings crumbling with age. It was a shift in how the cities functioned and in how people lived within them. By the end, many of the great urban centers of the Indus no longer resembled the marvels they once were. They were still cities in name, but the civilization that had created them was already fading away. As the great cities of the Indus began to fade, their people did not vanish. Instead, they moved. Archaeological evidence suggests that many communities gradually migrated eastward, away from the drying rivers and failing infrastructure, toward more stable water sources in the Ganges plain. Others left the cities behind and settled in smaller, rural villages. Some moved into the foothills and highlands, adapting to new environments. These were not mass evacuations, but slow, generational shifts. Family by family, people dispersed, seeking farmland, water, or simply a place to begin again. And in doing so, they didn't abandon everything. They carried with them elements of Indus life: pottery styles, bead-making traditions, farming knowledge, and religious symbols. Over time, these traditions merged with local cultures to form something new. In eastern Punjab, Haryana, and western Uttar Pradesh, later settlements show clear echoes of Indus craftsmanship and organization. Even without cities or writing, the cultural memory endured. This phase, sometimes called the late Harappan, period was not a rebirth, but a transformation. It marked the end of one way of life and the beginning of many others. The Indus people did not disappear. They dispersed into the hills, the plains, and the future, leaving behind not a ruin, but a legacy, reshaped by time and distance. Many ancient civilizations fell through conquest brought down by invading armies, burning cities, and violent upheaval. But the Indus Valley tells a different story. Across dozens of sites from Mohenjodaro to Harappa, archaeologists have found almost no signs of warfare. Weapons are rare. Mass graves, fortifications, and battle damage are virtually non-existent. The great cities were not destroyed by fire. They were not overrun by foreign armies. They were left behind. Walls crumbled, not from siege, but from neglect. Drainage systems failed not from sabotage, but from disuse. People moved not as refugees, but as migrants seeking new places to live. Even skeletons recovered from Indus sites show little evidence of violent trauma. The fall of this civilization appears to have been slow, quiet, and systemic, shaped by environmental change, economic strain, and gradual depopulation. Some scholars once theorized an invasion by Indo-Aryan peoples, but no archaeological record supports that view. Instead, the evidence points to internal decline, a complex, multi-layered process that unfolded over generations. In this way, the Indus Valley's collapse is unique. It was not a battlefield ending. It was a fading, like a candle going out slowly, rather than being snuffed out by force. And perhaps that quiet ending tells us something deeper about the kind of civilization they had been all along. The last chapter of the Indus Valley civilization unfolded quietly. There was no single collapse, no final battle, just a gradual loss of what had once connected it all. One of the most telling signs was the disappearance of writing. The Indus script, found for centuries on seals, tablets, and pottery, vanished from the archaeological record. There are no bilingual texts, no long inscriptions, and now, no new examples after 1300 BCE. Without writing, a civilization loses part of its voice, its ability to remember, record, and organize across distances. At the same time, the cultural unity that once stretched across 1,000 kilometers began to break apart. The shared bricks, seals, and weights gave way to regional variation. Local styles and traditions replaced a once standard system. By 1300 BCE, the great cities were no longer cities. Mohenjodaro, Harappa, Dholavira, all either abandoned or transformed into smaller rural communities. Their infrastructure crumbled, their institutions faded, and the Indus civilization, once one of the largest in the ancient world, slipped into history. But even in its ending, it left a legacy. Pottery designs, farming practices, and cultural symbols lived on, not in cities, but in scattered villages. The script was lost, but not everything was forgotten. In place of a single civilization, a mosaic of cultures emerged, each carrying fragments of what came before. This was not just the end of an era, it was the beginning of something new.